you, like many Bitcoiners, you sound like you're a free market guy. You don't necessarily want the regulation, but just going off any administration, forcing to talk about and maybe implement on Bitcoin mining, what's one policy you'd like to see to make America a leader in Bitcoin mining?
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. I'm glad we're chatting about this because, aside from just advocating for Bitcoin mining to policymakers and regulators, Satoshi Action Fund also crafts regulation and policy in-house model policy. And so after we educate these folks and we say, hey, here's the benefits of Bitcoin mining. It's going to provide high paying jobs. It's going to provide local investment. It's going to stabilize the grid. It's going to help with renewables. And it's also going to help ensure that you're able to monetize any excess energy that's created on your grid as well. And so when I share some of the benefits of Bitcoin mining to people, especially policy regulatory wise, they're just like, oh, wow, I had no idea Bitcoin mining can do that. And then from there, they're just like, well, how do I safely and responsibly adopt Bitcoin mining in my city or my state or my province? Luckily for Satoshi Action Fund, the majority of energy policy happens at the state and provincial level. So we don't have to concern ourselves with the federal government, which is great because the federal government is slow and monotonous and probably one of the most, it's one of the easiest places to go and have your soul die. And kind of like any policy that you want to do, you pretty much have to give up more than you get back in return. That's just the way that the horse trading occurs in DC. That's very different than the states. The states somewhat compete over industry. They compete for jobs. We've seen it with the tech industry. We've seen it with the automobile industry. It's very, very common for states to be like, hey, we're willing to just try this new policy out to see if we can capture this new market, this new industry. And so we have two pieces of model policy that we've created that we think will really help states move the right direction. One of them is a microgrid and grid resiliency policy, which will basically say, you can come in, you can create a microgrid zone, and within those microgrid zones, power generation can be created and managed potentially by the miner, potentially by the utility themselves, but it'll help miners and people who plug into that generation avoid costs of transmission, dramatically lowering their power prices. But then again, how do we get utilities to be on board and how do we get public utility commissions to be on board? Those are kind of the governing, there's the utility, which has the, regulated monopoly. You don't really get your choice over who you buy your power from. And then you have public utility commissions, which govern those monopolies. But you need to get those guys on board when you create something like this. And so we, within there, created a framework that would say to the microgrid operator, you have to perform demand response and frequency response back to the grid if and when there is a grid interconnection. So that one is big. That one's key. And we're really looking for a lot of states to move in the right direction on that one. We have, I would say, at least 3, maybe 4 states with advocacy organizations or policymakers on the ground who are willing to push that policy forward. The other one is the orphaned oil well policy. So this is getting into like the environmental cleanup aspect. There are millions of orphaned oil wells all over Alberta, Canada, all over various states through the US, including Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, a few others in there as well. I think New York is one of them.
These are oil wells that are no longer in use.
Yeah. So unfortunately, in the oil and gas industry, there are boom and bust cycles and just kind of unpredictable problems that occur when you're going into the ground very deep to find oil or gas. And so occasionally, because of the, either lack of production, there could be a bust in oil and gas prices. A lot of these operators go bankrupt, or they just, don't care because the well isn't producing anything anymore and they don't want to have to like clean it up. There's a lot of problems that were created because of that process. And so now we have up to 10 million of these abandoned wells. Up to is a big number, 10 million. It could be anywhere from 5 to 10 million. And these wells are emitting methane into the atmosphere. And methane, as most people know, is 84x worse than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period and 27 times worse for warming over a 100-year period. And those numbers are probably going to be changing as time goes on, getting worse because of just some of the chemical makeup of the atmosphere. So these wells are emitting methane and it's just wrecking our environment. It's not only is it going into the air and helping to warm the planet, it is also leaking into groundwater and causing groundwater contamination. It's a massive problem in Texas and in some other states. The problem is no one wants to go in and take these things and remediate them or mitigate them or clean them up or plug them. It's expensive and you don't get anything in return. So there's a lot of efforts underway to try to figure out how to solve this problem. And that's why we came up with this orphaned oil well policy. It would essentially allow the states to give their orphaned oil wells over to a Bitcoin miner. The Bitcoin miner would be able to go in and mine gas, and the state can decide if they would like, after a certain period of time, for the miner to make enough money to afford to plug the well, or some states may want to continue production and allow the miners to continue. But ultimately, either way, it results in a massive reduction of methane emissions, which is a huge problem. All the major environmental groups are starting to turn towards methane as a big problem. And it doesn't just get emitted from these orphaned oil wells. It gets emitted from landfills. It gets emitted from wastewater treatments and from agriculture. And most environmental groups have come to the conclusion that this is the kind of the new fight that we all need to face. Like, we're getting control over carbon. There is some positive movements that are happening in that area, but methane is totally out of control and is causing massive amounts of warming. And it may be the thing that leads to us moving too far into the danger zone. And that's why I'm excited about this piece of policy, because it not only gives states the opportunity to say, hey, Bitcoin miners, come in. We want you here in our space. We want you to clean up the environment. But it could also lead to giving us more time to reduce methane and reduce carbon and avoid some of the dangerous warming temperatures that'll kind of lead to even, worse things down the road, whether it be, kind of making places uninhabitable, heating up certain areas of the planet so much that you can't grow plants or agriculture. There are many problems that could come from too much of an increase in global temperatures. We aren't quite there yet. And we could avoid it potentially if we get a handle on methane emissions. And that's why we're really excited about pushing this policy, because it's a positive environmental cleanup story for Bitcoin mining. But it also brings jobs. It also brings in a nascent tech infrastructure that states can build revenue off of. And also, with these orphaned oil wells, you can now take those wells off the responsibility of the state and off the responsibility of the taxpayer. The only way you can go negative is consuming energy. And we're really fortunate that methane as a gas, because you can't burn carbon, right? Like, it's impossible. It's not an energy source, but methane is. And Bitcoin mining is one of the only customers of energy that can go after just absolutely stranded, completely remote methane sources and do it in a scalable way, right? Because you can have 20 miners on a spot. You can do a megawatt. There's not very many businesses that are willing to go set up a megawatt on top of a landfill. But Bitcoin mining can, and it can go after non-flared, non-vented stranded methane. And if it goes after enough non-flared, non-vented stranded methane, there's not an environmental group on the planet that can deny that Bitcoin mining is having a positive impact on climate and then also turning potentially carbon negative at a certain point. And I believe that Bitcoin mining could turn carbon negative. Talking to quite a few environmentalists that agree with me, and two of them believe that it can happen within the next 2 years.